So we will be going over the manuscript instructions. We'll be writing as a group, so most people are in groups of 4, some people are in groups of 3, maybe later on there might be a group of 5, but for now, 4 and 3 people per group. Your papers and worksheets should read completely different than other groups in the lab or as a class in a whole. And you'll be writing this in Google Docs. This is required as I need to be able to go back and see who contributed to what. Scientific manuscripts versus lab reports. Lab reports demonstrate you understand a scientific method in an experiment or assignment carried out in your lab. Typically, short write ups of what was done and the results. The target audience and readers is often classmates or instructors. Scientific papers communicate a hypothesis and how the hypothesis was tested, so must independently develop a broader context of importance of an hypothesis, requires a more in-depth interpretation of outcome, and compares the results of a broader scientific field using primary literature. The target audience or readers are other members of the scientific community outside of the lab of study. So lab reports typically allow for lists of materials, informal mentions of classmates and classroom environment, and perhaps personal feelings of the results. But scientific papers are written strictly as a narrative, so there's no list of materials. You do not mention unrelated events such as classroom environment or the people there, and it should be as free as personal bias as possible. We will be writing the scientific manuscript. So for this experiment, you'll be communicating your results in the form of a published peer-reviewed literature. Although yours will not go through the peer review process other than your GAs. So your paper will take the format of the papers you're reciting within it. So in scientific writing is formulaic. So there's general expectations and patterns in scientific writing. And once you start seeing the patterns, these become easier to write. So we're going to start with the paper title. The title is constructed a phrase that clearly addresses the context or purpose and or the results of the experiment. So optimal foraging theory in ants is too broad and doesn't address any scientific questions or results. So increased parasitic load reduces ant foraging in grasslands, gives a better indication of what the paper will contain. Here's some examples on the bottom. You can read them if you want. And this is a general model of how you should write your paper, the hourglass model. So you start very broad in the introduction, you answer some of these questions, you get narrower and focus into your particular experiment and the methods and results. And in the discussion, you go back broad. So what does your results show for the entire field? How does it affect the future? How might other researchers use your results? So for the introduction, this is the overall aspects. So your introduction provides background, context, and purpose of the experiment. It should include a summary of the a broad state of knowledge pertaining to the experimental topic, the goals of the experimental study, and how it relates to knowledge in the field, and present the hypothesis and or the objectives of your study, with a few brief details on those objectives and how they were accomplished in your experiment. Your introduction should follow a logical progress of ideas and presentation of information. So giving background on a broad area of study, so optimal foraging, then your background of your particular independent variable, so predators, resources, competition, etc. And then finally, the background of your study system, so ants and their social insect. So finish introductions with a brief description summarizing main objectives and the hypothesis. Don't state the null hypothesis, just like the alternative hypothesis. And then your predictions and a brief description of the major methods. Your introduction should be at least 4 paragraphs long. So here's an example of a paper. The introduction is effects of habitat complexity on the diversity and abundance of microfauna colonizing artificial kelp holdfasts. So the introduction here starts very broad. It just talks about ecology and how the abundance and diversity of species are controlled and regulated. It's very, very broad. And then it introduces the independent variable, so algal communities. And then it narrows down to their system. So they talk about the macroalgae, we'll be talking about ants. Your last paragraph should contain your objectives, hypothesis, predictions, and a brief description of your methodology.